The longer I stared at Jackson's name on my screen, the more I could feel my panic fading, but it was being replaced by white-hot rage. Suddenly, all the stress and frustrations from the past few days came bubbling to the surface, and now I knew exactly where to aim it at. I answered the call before he could even say a word. I screamed at him for a good 30 seconds, cursing him out, calling him every name under the sun. I took a moment to catch my breath, and in that transitory silence, he asked if I had gotten it all out of my system. I told him not all of it, but just enough to think clearly. Then I asked him to tell me exactly what was going on. No bullshit, no lies. We were well past that now. The situation was completely fucked, and he owed me some answers. He took a deep breath, and then he laid it all out. He told me that when we'd gone out that night, I'd blacked out bad. I was throwing up, acting belligerent, barely able to walk straight. It was severe enough that he was forced to sober up in order to make sure that I didn't get myself into any trouble. By the time he finally managed to pull me out of the bar, he actually felt sober enough to drive. Still not an excuse to drive, but he still considered calling an Uber, then immediately decided that it wasn't worth it. So he led me back to the car and threw me in the back seat. By the time he'd turned the engine over, I was snoring, out cold. The drive back to my place was smooth enough until he turned off the highway and onto the residential street that was just a few blocks away from my building. He said that all the streetlights were out, and he had to slow down and squint ahead in order to be able to tell where he was going. It became so bad that he decided to turn his high beams on. There were no other cars around, so he felt safe enough to do so. But the moment that his lights came on, they illuminated what looked like a woman sitting on the road about a dozen feet away. She was hunched over, face buried in her hands. He said that he'd nearly jumped out of his skin upon seeing her, because she hadn't been there before he had turned the lights on. I asked him how he could be so sure of that, since it had been so dark out. He just told me that he was certain of it, that she hadn't been there. He got out of the car to go check on her, but stopped himself after a few steps. He said it was so quiet outside that it felt surreal. No wind, no distant sounds of traffic, absolutely nothing. But the most disturbing part was that he'd thought the woman had been crying. Her head and shoulders were bobbing up and down, as if she were sobbing furiously. And she continued to do so as he cautiously approached her. But before he could get too close, he decided to drop the issue. Maybe it really was a woman in distress, but his gut was telling him something else. That he was actually in the presence of something extremely dangerous. He walked back to the car and shut the doors. But when he looked at the road again, the woman was now standing, moving toward us with these unnaturally long strides. By the time that he'd overcome the initial shock of seeing that, she was standing right in front of the car. He said that there was something wrong with her face, features uncanny, stretched out too far. He began backing up when the woman suddenly slammed her head viciously down onto the hood, and then she did it again. And again. He panicked and hit the gas, but she followed the car wherever it went, sticking to the hood like glue, continuing to bash her head. So he put the car in drive instead. The vehicle lurched forward, and the woman bounced off the windshield, her body catching a split second of air before landing. He stopped and looked into the rearview mirror, seeing the outline of her figure sprawled out onto the pavement behind us. Still not moving. I was still passed out, so he just sat there in the dark, silent, as his mind moved 1,000,000 miles a minute. He wondered if he just committed homicide, but given how the woman was behaving, surely he had an argument for self-defense. He began questioning how the woman had even managed to slam her head so many times with such force. Each one sounded like a gunshot, every impact shaking the steering wheel. What the hell was she? Ultimately, he convinced himself that it was better to go out and check on her. Maybe she had just been wired on PCP or something. If that were the case, then leaving the scene would have been a really bad look for him. He crawled over to his trunk and grabbed the crowbar he kept back there. He said he didn't really know why, because he should have been able to handle her without it. She looked to be about 100 pounds lighter than him. She should have also been dead. He said that the closer he got to her body, the weirder he felt, and he only understood why once he was standing right over it. It was a mannequin. Realistic, but still utterly artificial. He reached down and touched its skin, and all he could feel was cold plastic. This thing wasn't alive. It shouldn't have had the capacity to be alive. He tried picking it up and found that it weighed no more than 10 pounds. He went back to the car and stared at the dents that had been left behind on the hood. They were larger than he'd expected. Looked like they had been caused by a wild animal. Then he looked back at the woman/mannequin and saw her sitting up, staring at him. He got right back into his car and drove away. A few minutes later, he dropped me off. He said that he might have been able to convince himself that it was a dream or a hallucination, if there hadn't been very real damage done to his car. Damage he was forced to look at every day when he drove to work. He also knew what he saw, how real it felt. For the entire next week, he lived his life on high alert. He said that he wasn't sure what he was expecting to happen, but that he sure as hell didn't feel safe. But nothing did happen, at least not that week. Life went on as normal. By the time that the second week rolled around, he was starting to relax. He still couldn't stop himself from looking over his shoulder, but he was still more willing to accept that it had just been a one-off incident. He had been dealing with something dangerous and abnormal, but he was free from it now. He'd escaped it. But then, he got the email. He said that the dread he felt while reading it was something you had to experience in order to understand. The email by itself would have been ridiculous, but given what had happened, this just about drove him to a breakdown. I brought up the line about the sewer, how the person in the story had supposedly dragged her into one, based on his account of things that hadn't happened. I didn't mean to make it sound as if I thought he was lying about that part, but I did. At this point, I didn't feel like I could trust the guy. He sounded earnest enough, but I'd gone through too much to fully accept what he was telling me. He just told me that the woman was lying. He'd never tried dragging her into a sewer. There hadn't even been a manhole nearby. I asked him what reason it would have to try and frame him for something like that. What was the point? He told me he didn't know, but that it didn't matter. Clearly it was trying to fuck with him, mess with his head. I then asked him the inevitable question. "Why the fuck did you forward that email to me?" He went silent. I repeated the question. He told me that he panicked, that he hadn't been thinking straight. I told him that wasn't a good enough excuse, that he had no right dragging me into this shit. Why couldn't he have just found 5 inactive addresses and forwarded it to them? He said that he tried that, but it doesn't work. They had to belong to real people. The email he'd sent to me hadn't even been the original. That one had stated that if he didn't forward the message, she'd show up inside his closet. So, that night, he had set up a camera to face the closet in his room while he stayed awake at a 24/7 cafe a few blocks away. When he checked the footage the next morning, he could see her face peeking out behind his clothes. "It knows exactly what you're doing," he said. "You have to follow the rules. It knows when you try and skirt around them. It won't accept that. It won't stop. It'll never stop." Then I asked him why it had to be me. A selfish question, but I still wanted to know. Why did he have to send it to me? He just told me he was sorry. I told him that wasn't an answer. Why me? Why did I have to be a part of this? He then admitted that he'd feel guilty about screwing over anybody else. So I asked why I was different. Why he didn't feel about doing it to me. He clarified that he did feel bad about it, that he hates himself for it. But that I had been there that night. That whether I liked it or not, I was a part of this. I told him that didn't make any sense. I hadn't seen the woman that night. I wasn't the one that she'd first sent the email to. He said that I was naive to think that I was separate from all this, that I wasn't involved, that eventually it would have caught up to me, that she doesn't forget. So I asked him why he'd bother to call me then if he was just going to justify everything. Did he expect me to forgive him? Could he not live with this on his conscience or something? He said that he wasn't expecting forgiveness, but that he still owed me an explanation. That I at least deserved to know what had happened. I asked him why he'd waited all the way until now to do so. He told me that he couldn't handle it anymore. That this was no longer worth dealing with. He'd deleted his emails. He'd stopped looking at his phone. But that doesn't stop her. She always finds a way. He's been seeing them written out on dusty surfaces or carved into trees. One time a barista had stared him dead in the eyes and told him that the woman was going to disembowel him the next time he went into a washroom before smiling and handing him his coffee. She couldn't be escaped. No matter what he did or where he went, she'd be there. He said that he's already put countless others in danger, and it's taken him way too long to realize that's exactly what she'd wanted from him, what she's been using him for. So he was going to put an end to it. But first, he wanted me to know that he really was sorry, that he should have ended it the moment he'd gotten the first email and avoided all this. I told him not to do anything drastic, that there was a plan in place to try and deal with her. But he wasn't listening. I think I heard him scoff. He said that everything had already been set in stone the minute that he first saw her. Perhaps even before then, there was no point. The last thing he told me before hanging up was that this was not going to get any better. That I had been warned. I left the bathroom and had the cops trace the call. They pinged it in the middle of some forest that was about an 8-hour drive away. They said they'd send somebody out there to check on him, but that in the meantime we needed to get going. That my eyes were starting to get red. They led me into a slick-looking unmarked SUV with large tires that was waiting outside. Sat in the back with me were Luke and a SWAT officer. It might have been the same one that had been there in the motel. I couldn't tell for sure. The windows were all tinted from the inside and the front seats had been separated so we couldn't see up there. This is all to say that we could have been on Mars, and I wouldn't have been able to tell. Luke explained that the location of the cave was classified information, that I was actually better off not knowing. I just nodded. Once we started moving, Luke took out a small vial and dumped out a single white pill onto his hand. He offered it to me. "Caffeine pill," he said. I took it, swallowed it back with water. I'd taken caffeine pills a lot during college, and this didn't feel the same. It felt a lot better than caffeine. I didn't question it. Luke told me to settle in, but not too much. We were going to be driving for a while. He asked me what my favorite movie was, and then he pulled out a laptop. We finished Gangs of New York and were halfway through Fight Club when things started to get really bumpy. It no longer felt like we were on a road. If we hadn't been wearing seatbelts, we would have been pinballing all over the place. At one point, the vehicle stopped and we could hear the driver getting out. He began arguing with whoever was in the passenger seat, and it quickly turned into something heated. I asked Luke what the hell was going on, but he just told me not to worry about it. A few minutes later, we were moving again. Another half hour and we had stopped again. Luke smiled, told me that we had arrived. Then he asked me again how I was feeling. I told him I was doing all right, still alert, but that the pill he'd given me was starting to wear off. He said that was a good thing, that it needed to be out of my system entirely in order for me to sleep. We got out of the car and stepped out into the woods, deep woods. The air was heavy with moss, pine, and moisture. Tall trees and dense foliage all around. I was surprised to find out that we weren't the only ones there. Turns out, our vehicle had been part of a larger convoy. 4 SUVs total. Stepping out of the cars were more SWAT, some others wearing FBI jackets and cargo pants. I asked Luke why there were so many people here. Specifically, why we needed so much firepower. He just told me that the FBI were here to observe, and that the SWAT were here to make things go smoother. I tried pressing him for some more information, but he didn't seem keen on giving me anything else. He just told me not to worry. That my safety was everybody's #1 priority. I sort of believed him. We ended up having to hike about another mile before we reached the cave. There wasn't an actual trail to guide us, so I just followed Luke as we pushed through the thick brush until we had reached the clearing where it sat. It was a wholly inconspicuous entrance. Just a slight opening in a rock wall. We had to duck down to enter it. Luke handed me a flashlight, though it really wasn't needed, because everybody else had one as well. Like I said, I had never been inside a cave before. But this was a far cry from what I had imagined. It didn't seem natural. Instead of jagged walls and narrow passages, it was a wide path that sloped down gradually. Not steep enough for it to be too difficult to traverse, but just enough that if you started running down, you wouldn't be able to stop. I looked around at the walls, the floor. It was just smooth, remarkably unadulterated stone. The air carried a faint scent of mold. It was a hard thing to make sense of. Hard to believe. I asked Luke if they knew who had built this place. He shook his head, said that if anybody had built it at all, they didn't have the slightest clue who it could have been, or for what purpose. Every so often, the path branched off, sometimes into 2, sometimes 3. Very rarely there were 4 or 5 or even 6 different directions to choose from, but I guess they had already mapped out the place pretty well because they seemed to know exactly where to go. Soon the fatigue had become a monster. I could feel my eyes starting to burn, my eyelids growing heavy. Whenever my vision would start to blur, I would squeeze my eyes shut for a few seconds before opening them again. I'm not sure if it really did anything. I'd never been so tired. Sometimes Luke would grab me by the shoulder and squeeze, telling me we were almost there. A line he repeated for hours. When I asked him how long we had been walking, he told me he wasn't sure, that this was a place where clocks and stopwatches weren't able to function. After an unknowable stretch of time, the floor finally leveled out, and the path opened up into a larger chamber. Based on the echoes from our footsteps, the place was absolutely massive. I could hear Luke take a deep breath before telling me that it was right up ahead. We walked a bit further, and soon we could see it. Everybody stopped. I could hear several mechanical clicks and realized it was the officers disengaging the safeties on their rifles. The cabin itself was a peculiar sight. It wasn't some creepy, run-down place. It looked clean, modern. In any other setting, it would have been inviting. Luke told me that once we went inside, I would need to follow him, to not look around too much. That as long as I did that, I didn't have much to worry about. I just nodded. I didn't have the energy to question much of anything anymore. Inside smelled like dust, old wood, and something else that was extremely unpleasant but unidentifiable. I did what Luke said and followed him close while staring straight ahead. But then we turned a corner, and I nearly had a heart attack when I saw somebody crouched by the fireplace, looking up at us. They were pale, naked, and hairless. Their mouth was hanging open, and a thick, oily substance was dripping from their lips. I asked Luke what the hell that was supposed to be, and he just told me not to look at it. That the SWAT team would take care of it if necessary. A few more turns, and we had arrived in a bedroom. One of the officers closed the door, and then everybody gathered around the bed and stared at me.
"Well, go on,"
Luke said to me.
"All that's left now is to fall asleep."
I put my flashlight down and took a long exhale, and then moved forward, crawled onto the mattress. The sheets were cold to the touch as I pulled them over my chest. As I laid my head on the pillow, I noticed another one of the pale figures standing in one of the corners, and then another one crouching on top of a dresser as if ready to pounce at any moment. There were probably more that I hadn't noticed, but I did my best to ignore them. I closed my eyes, but despite being as tired as I'd ever been, I couldn't stop my heart from pounding. I tried performing some breathing exercise that I'd learned long ago and just barely remembered, but they worked. Slowly, I was able to settle down, and soon, I had passed out. Then I woke up, still in the cabin, but not underground. Luke, the FBI, the SWAT team, they were all gone. None of the pale figures were there either. I was alone. I looked down at my hands, then up at the ceiling. The air was warm. It smelled fresh. I realized that I was no longer tired. Not at all. Was this a dream? Or had I just woken up? I sat up and got out of the bed and stared out the window. The forest was a bright, vibrant green. Blue skies above. A pleasant enough scene, but immediately I could tell that something was off. It was the silence. Something so absolute that it couldn't have been possible. No wind, no birds, no insects. I couldn't even hear my own heartbeat. These details led me to conclude that this had to have been some dream. It just had to be. Of course, I had never experienced a dream that had felt so real, so visceral. What was I supposed to do here? I tried slapping myself in the face a few times, but then I thought about where I was in reality and wondered if I really wanted to wake up. It might have been preferable to just hang around here. Then I started hearing something. Sounded like a continuous succession of quick, distant thuds, getting louder, closer. Footsteps, I realized. Somebody running. Soon a figure had burst out from the trees, moving frighteningly fast as they sprinted across the clearing towards the cabin. Although I couldn't get a clear look at them, I knew exactly who it was. And then I heard the door swing open. I hesitated for a moment before opening up the window and jumping out. I looked back into the cabin and saw the woman standing still in the bedroom, staring at me. Up until that point, I had never actually seen her in the daylight, and I wish that hadn't changed. She looked like something sketched based on a hazy recollection of a grotesque nightmare. Large eyes recessed into the skull, no nose, no ears, thin lips curled into a wide, hateful smile, as if she were enjoying my fear. But if this was a dream, then I shouldn't have been in any danger, right? Suddenly, I wasn't so sure. I was almost certain that the second I started running, she'd be coming after me. So I tried backing away slowly instead. The entire time, I kept my eyes right on her, ready to bolt the second she made a move, which she never did. Once I was far enough away where I could no longer see her, I could begin to breathe again. But then I thought about how strange that was. Breathing? Have you ever remembered breathing in a dream? Was that possible? I tried purging that thought from my head and turned around, began venturing into the woods. No idea where to go, but I felt more comfortable walking as opposed to standing still. I walked for a long time. I could feel the fatigue building in my legs. It felt so real. This had to be real, but it couldn't have been because the cave had felt real as well. So then, what the hell was this? My brain could hardly handle it anymore. I closed my eyes and dropped to my knees. Why the fuck did I have to deal with this? Why the fuck had I gotten so unlucky? Soon I could no longer contain my frustrations, and I began to scream. And I only stopped in my throat when hoarse. When I could no longer produce anything more than a croak, I stayed kneeling as I listened to the dying echoes of my voice through the trees. It had felt good, cathartic. But instead of dying out, the echoes became louder, and it was no longer my voice. Something much more shrill in tone, a sound that made my hair stand tall. I stood up and looked around, trying to pinpoint where exactly it was coming from. After a while of squinting through the trees, I saw it. A pale figure. The woman. She was sprinting right towards me, but in a strange way, as if her body couldn't keep up with the speed in which she was moving, causing her to continuously stumble forward like a crazed wild animal, still screaming. I turned and ran, doing my best to weave a path through the dense forest while ignoring the screaming. I was so focused on getting away from her that I hadn't noticed the sharp drop ahead. It appeared suddenly, without precedence, and I couldn't stop myself from running right off of it. I was airborne for a moment before I landed rough, tumbling down a steep hill until a tree broke my momentum. My head was pounding, and my back screamed in pain. For a second, I thought I was paralyzed. When I realized that I wasn't, I slowly pulled myself up, stumbling down the rest of the hill before looking back up it, expecting to see the woman staring at me from above. But she wasn't there, and the screaming had stopped. I began to feel some relief before the frustrations returned. What the fuck was she doing? Trying to taunt me. I continued walking through the forest until I reached a small creek. I knelt down and touched the cold water. I realized how thirsty I was. The water was clear enough that I was almost tempted to go ahead and drink from it. But I decided against that, simply splashing my face with it instead. It was so refreshing that I just continued to do it. That was until I felt something grab onto me. I wiped the water from my eyes and looked down to see a set of pale fingers wrapped around my wrist. Suddenly, it yanked me down into the creek, and I was forced to use my free hand to try and push my head out of the water before I drowned. But then it just yanked me down again, harder this time. My face smashed into one of the larger rocks and the pain was searing, my mouth filled with the taste of copper. The grip was strong enough that I could feel my hand slowly sinking into the soil below. I grimaced, shook my head. No way in hell was I going out like this. I planted my heels into the ground and began pulling my arm back as hard as I could, but it still felt like I was stuck, so I panicked. I began stomping wildly into the creek. I became reckless enough that I started stomping on my own hand, and while it hurt like hell, I didn't stop, because I could feel the grip beginning to break. Once it did, I was launched backwards onto my ass. I crawled a good distance away from the creek before looking down at my hand, and it was a gruesome sight. The skin was bright red, in the early stages of swelling. A few of my fingers were horrifically bent, and then I could feel the blood leaking from my nose. I looked back at the creek and saw the woman climbing out of it. that horrid smile still plastered across her face. I started running again. Sometimes I'd turn around and see her in the corner of my vision before she disappeared. Sometimes I'd see her head poking out from the trees and I'd pivot and change direction. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps behind me, which stopped the second I turned around to check. I didn't know how long I'd been running, but I knew that I couldn't go for much longer. My legs and lungs were burning, my head pounding, nose, back, and hand screaming in pain. Even my spirit was beginning to dwindle. A part of me that just wanted to lie down and accept whatever horrible fate that the woman had in store for me. But I wasn't ready to resign to that just yet, so I kept on trudging ahead. Eventually, the forest floor gave way to a perfectly sheer cliff. I looked to my left and right, and it seemed to extend indefinitely in either direction, as if the world had been sliced clean apart by some colossal blade. I looked down, seeing what appeared to be clouds floating below. Clouds. That didn't make any sense. But then none of this made any sense. Maybe this wasn't a dream, but it sure as hell wasn't real life either. I turned around, seeing the woman in the distance, once again sprinting towards me. It had been terrifying the first time, but now I was just getting tired of it. Why was she doing this? If she wanted me dead, why didn't she just go ahead and do it? Clearly, she had the means to do so. But then maybe she couldn't, because I wasn't actually awake. I looked down at the clouds, then back at the woman, still barreling towards me. I could try and keep running, but I had this feeling that it wouldn't solve anything. That I'd be running forever, and this shit would never end. I realized that she was trying to break me, that she thought I was weak. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and stepped over the edge. The sudden weightlessness was jarring. My heart was pounding, and I could feel an electric jolt moving up through my body. But then came the numbness, the lightheadedness, and soon I could feel nothing at all. The entire time I was waiting for the impact, but it never came. Eventually I opened my eyes and found myself suspended in a white void. It didn't feel like I was falling anymore, just floating in this surreal dimension that seemed separate from time and space. I remained floating there for a long while, which I didn't mind so much, because it felt nice, as if my entire body were enveloped in a soft, warm blanket. I could feel no more pain. No more anxiety. I felt at ease, as if this was exactly where I belonged, where I was supposed to be. Slowly, shapes began to materialize around me. Colors began to seep in. Then I could hear voices. I could feel myself laying down, my fingers gripping cotton sheets. I was in a bed. In a hospital room. I sat up and looked at my fingers and saw them devoid of any injury. I touched my nose. No pain. Nothing swollen. After a while, a nurse came in and she seemed surprised that I was awake. I asked her how long I'd been out for. All she could tell me was that I'd been checked into the hospital for just north of 40 hours now. It took a few hours more before they cleared me to leave. Physically speaking, there was nothing wrong with me. As for the mental side, they said they still needed to run some tests. But I guess I seemed coherent enough that they were able to put those on hold. The nurse told me to wait in the lobby, that somebody would be picking me up. When I got down there, I found Luke and Detective Brito already waiting for me. They were both smiling, telling me how relieved they were to see me awake. I told them that I had a lot of questions, but there was one that I needed answered before anything else. What happened inside the cabin? Luke told me that once I'd gone to sleep, the woman had appeared at the side of the bed, bending so that her face hovered right above mine. They said that they tried waking me up, but I wasn't budging. Then they tried removing me from the bed, but they ran into complications. Because that's when the entities within the cabin decided to start coming after them. For a short while, it turned into a shit show. Bullets were fired, several people were injured, but no deaths, they assured me. One thing they noticed was that the woman never moved, at least not from where she was standing. They could see her body shaking as if she were desperately trying, but unable to do so. Everybody was able to make it out of the cabin. I was still completely passed out, so the officers alternated shifts carrying me as we made our way up and out of the cave. I was still asleep once we'd made it to the surface. I remained asleep for the entire car ride. They said it almost seemed like I was dead, save for the fact that I was still breathing. They called it bizarre, eerie. They'd never seen anything like it, and didn't know what to do. Even the doctors had no clue. They asked me how I was feeling, and I told them that I felt fine enough. A bit strange, a bit shocked, but I was functioning. The last thing I needed to know was whether or not the woman was still there. Luke told me that she was, that they'd set up cameras in the bedroom and were continuously monitoring her. She still hadn't moved, and if she ever did, I'd be the first one to know. I'm back in my apartment now. I know I should be relieved, and in the ways that matter the most, I suppose I am, but the questions and concerns still linger. The guilt as well. About Elisa and the others who had received the email and hadn't taken it seriously because why the fuck would they? Even guilt about Jackson himself. They told me that they'd found his body in his car, parked on an isolated stretch of road. Gunshot wound to the head. I understand what he's done, but I still can't help how I feel. I still haven't checked my phone. Haven't looked at any screens at all. They told me that I should be safe to do so, but that's a leap of faith I've still yet to take. I know it will take some time for things to go back to normal. I hope that eventually they will. But there's a voice in my head telling me that it's going to take a lot more to truly get rid of her.